So, how do you change your patterns of behavior in support of your quest for power and influence? You can change your behavior in ad hoc ways to develop a broader repertoire of effective behaviors. For example, providing some type of tangible recognition or subscribing to the notion that people look to others in deciding what to do. But if you really want to take the quantum leap in effectiveness, you will need to change fundamental patterns of belief, feeling, and behavior. This goes back to the point made in the first seminar, that power is costly and risky.
And to most of us, at some level, perhaps subconsciously, it's a frightening bottom line.
Professor Dwyer will direct you to the method he uses to change his patterns of belief, emotion, and behavior. He will also share additional resources that you can tap into to fashion your own approach.
You can change how you think about things, you can change beliefs, you can change your emotional reactions to things, and you can certainly change the patterns of your behavior and the ways in which you act in the world. You can, in fact, determine and control the quality of your own life.
Welcome to Ultimate Power.
In a fundamental sense, our whole life and the quality of our life takes place between our ears, doesn't it? You can say you travel, but when you travel, what's really happening? Your brain, your sensors are taking in data fragments from some other part of the world and processing them and making sense of them. And we all know that two people can stand shoulder to shoulder and take in exactly the same stimuli, exactly the same data fragments, and make entirely different sense of it, and feel very differently about it, and act very differently with respect to it. So this self-design really means you can go into your head and change virtually anything that is in there. You can change how you think about things, you can change beliefs, you can change your emotional reactions to things, and you can certainly change the patterns of your behavior and the ways in which you act in the world. You can, in fact, determine and control the quality of your own life. Now, there's been a lot of literature around this topic in the last 15 or 20 years, a lot of the things that are called the self-help literature. There's also been an enormous amount of exaggeration, hyperbole, hype, magnification. Whenever an idea of this importance comes on the scene, you can expect all the hustlers to come out. All the con artists come out and pick up a few words, a few ideas, and then start to sell them, because the prospect of designing yourself as an adult is just so attractive to human beings. I don't have to be what I have been up until now. I do not have to be this accumulation of what I'm calling the accidental self. But one of the things I want you to remember as we go through this material today, if you decide to design yourself, remember you can no longer blame the architect, because that's you. And this really is relatively new information. I think it is revolutionary in its prospect. And it is based on some current, last 20 years of research about how the human brain acts, how it takes in information, how it's designed, how it responds. Most of you have probably heard the distinction left brain, right brain, and again, it's been over-popularized and overdone. But nonetheless, it makes a convenient category system to talk about phenomena, about characteristics of us that we're all somewhat aware of. And what's really useful about the research is that it begins to tell us how we can systematically, based on empirically verified facts about the brain, go in and decide what we're going to be like in the future. And that has never happened before in the history of humankind. The ancient Egyptians did brain surgery. They did autopsies. They wanted to learn things. They had some sense that the brain made enormous differences in behavior. And ever since that time, people have been fascinated. And there have been brain damage and brain injury, and from that, people have picked up anecdotal information about how the brain works and specialization of the brain. But it wasn't until about 25 years ago that a procedure by a neurosurgeon was perfected that coincidentally allowed us to learn an awful lot about the brain. Some people would maintain in the research community we know more about the human brain today, and we have discovered more about the human brain in the last 15 to 20 years than we had accumulated in the last 3,000 years. I won't get into all the technical details of this, but basically A neurosurgeon who was treating people who had severe epilepsy hypothesized that if he went into the brain and cut what's called the corpus callosum, it's the communications network between the left side of the brain and the right side of the brain, these people suffering from severe epilepsy might get some relief, and indeed they did. The intensity and the frequency and the duration of their epileptic episodes, for the most part, began to decline. What did we now have for the first time on the face of the earth? We had a group of otherwise normal human beings who could not communicate between the left side of their brain and the right side of the brain. Well, researchers had a field day. We'd all heard about specialization of brain function, left brain, right brain, and then it got more sophisticated, the cerebral portion, the limbic portion. And then academics got into it and got what they just loved to have their hands on, a 2x2. Oh, we've got left brain, right brain, cerebral, and limbic, and they started drawing personality profiles and what have you. And again, some of it got overstated, and it looked like it might be a miracle response to human problems, and hey, it's not that. But it provides us with some very interesting notions, knowledge about who we are, how we got that way, and above all, the topic for today, how we can go about changing what goes on in our heads. And we've had a fascination with this topic, haven't we? Over the years. Oh, yeah. If only I could change myself in certain kinds of ways. One of the classic representations of this, both in literature and film, and we're going to see a piece of the film here, is Pygmalion, Liza Doolittle, and Professor Henry Higgins. But there is I think, a misnomer in the film. We're going to see a little scene from the beginning of that movie here in just a moment. Because Professor Henry Higgins, with his background and one might say his arrogance, he's going to design Liza Doolittle. But what we know about the human brain is you can't do that to another person without their permission. They pick and choose what they're going to take and what they're not going to take. And they have to have the motivation within themselves to say, yes, I want to change myself. So Pygmalion in our literature and in our film history is one of the clearest examples of someone who starts out one way with a series of patterns, a series of beliefs and thoughts, a series of emotional responses, and a series of patterns of behavior. And under the tutelage, because she wanted to, under the tutelage of Professor Henry Higgins, makes a transformation. Well, let's begin to look at the beginning area of Pygmalion and see what Liza Doolittle looks like and the relationship she has with the professor in the early part of this arrangement in what I will call more self-designed than designed by another. And if you remember either the book or any of the versions of the movies that have been made about Pygmalion, you'll realize that an enormous transformation, but a plausible one, takes place. Because indeed, he helps her change the way she thinks and the way she feels and the way she acts. And he gets a bit of a surprise at the end of the story because she has become her own person. She has designed herself. She hasn't taken everything given to her, and indeed she's gone out and gotten some things on her own. She's engaged in self-design. I don't think that's fanciful. We can each do it, and now, well after the Pygmalion period, we understand how each of us can, as an adult, go into our head and alter what goes on there. Change the quality of our lives, change life between the ears, as I like to call it. Let's go back to this left brain, right brain distinction because it has a lot to do with understanding what you and I were taught to do when we wanted to change ourselves, as opposed to what the literature on the structure and functioning of the brain now tells us we must do if we want to change ourselves in some significant way. The development of the literature on left brain, right brain is again fascinating. I don't want to go into all of it by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things that you've probably heard is that most human beings have a greater facility on the left side of their brain for what we think of as analytical tasks, linear tasks, logical tasks. That the left side of the brain tends to facilitate symbolic processing, as in language and in mathematics. And that the right side of the brain tends to imagination and creativity and intuition and has the center for most of our emotions, most of our feelings, most of our affect. And that indeed we see people who are dominantly left brain or right brain, and there's some evidence that that dominance comes from biology, from our genetics. You come into the world with a predilection toward left brain types of things or right brain types of things. And what even the ancient Egyptians knew, again from brain surgery, autopsy, injury, and so on and so forth, is that there's a crossover network in the brain from the point of view of controlling the body. That the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body in most human beings. With one interesting exception, by the way, and it is fascinating, it's a redundancy built into human beings. In your eyes, the left side of both eyes is controlled by the right side of the brain, and the right side of the eye is controlled by the left side of the brain in both eyes, so that if you were to have damage in one of your in your brain, okay, you would still be able to process the information. If you damaged one of your eyes, the other eye takes in and sends information across to both parts of the brain. It's just a wonderful redundancy built into the human physiology and neurophysiology. What people have begun to speculate about is not only personality differences between left and right brain dominance, but cultural differences. And there is some speculation that you can't have an industrialized society unless there is a real focus put on left brain skills. Because if you look at industrialization, or even our now post-industrial information age, it's very much focused on linear, analytical, logical processes, manipulation of symbols, mathematical and linguistic. And there again is a little speculation that some cultures have been resistant to industrialization, perhaps because they were right brain dominant cultures. They intuited, they felt, they sensed, they imagined. The current example that is sometimes used is the still Australian Aborigines who are still in the outback. That they somehow can move in that hostile environment and survive in that hostile environment in ways that we could not. That they have developed and sharpened some of these right brain capabilities, and they can sense things out there in the world. Well, again, there's a certain, at least superficial plausibility about this distinction if one looks at, for example, the United States. It is clear that we are a left brain dominant culture. To whom do most of the rewards in the culture go? The left brain dominant people. Now, they really do. There are exceptions because of technology, but if you look at the people who are in charge of corporations, if you look at the academic setting, you'll see that people with linguistic facility, people with mathematical facility, people who can structure things, people who can run companies, are the ones who tend to get the rewards. Being a physician is a combination, but mostly left brain. Being a lawyer is very left brain. Being an accountant is very left brain. Being a planner is very left brain. If we begin to look at architects, what do we begin to see? A movement from left to right, because now we're talking about creativity and imagination and intuition. But again, if you want the clearest expression of our culture as a left brain dominant culture, look at our schools. This huge public social enterprise. What two subjects in the school receive the least resource, the least amount of time, and nobody really cares how well they do in it because it doesn't count towards your grade point average? Art and music, the right brain dominant activities. The schools focus on the linear, the analytical, the logical, the mathematical, the linguistic. Most of the people who are attracted to the professoriate are left brain dominant people. Theories, hypotheses, empirical research, that's all left brain. In fact, I've probably confirmed something you've always known, and that is that we professors are literally half-witted. In fact, if you see us on campus, we're easily spotted because we tend to walk with a pronounced movement to the left forward. We're sort of, overdeveloped left cerebrals. This has also had, by the way, some dramatic implications for children in schools. If you have what is predominantly a left brain dominant school, taught by left brain dominant teachers, with left brain dominant administrators, and an administrator has to mean, order, columns that add up, processes, bells that ring on time, people who are in the right place at the right time. That's very left brain kinds of things. And then this child, this 5 or 6 year old child who is right brain dominant, who is independent, imaginative, creative, holistic in his or her thinking, walks in not knowing that their brain talents are somehow at odds with the structure of the system. What happens to those children? They get labeled. They're daydreamers. They're troublemakers. Perhaps the most pointed example, some of you may have had this happen to you. A right brain dominant child, again, if we can use this as a heuristic device, will look at a mathematical problem and often intuit the answer. I know the answer, gives the answer. The teacher says, well, how did you get there? Well, they can't give you the logical process by which they got, well, you don't get any credit. That was a lucky guess. The young children who have incredible imaginations and they have imaginary friends, and what do we do to them? Well, hey, you're grown up now. You're 8 years old. I mean, you don't have imaginary friends, so we punish those kinds of characteristics. I'll never forget my oldest son now, who's getting a Ph.D. in econometrics, was, I think, about 7 years old. He was in second grade, beg your pardon, and he was learning critical thinking. And he came home one day with a little piece of paper, little exercise that he had to do. And on the piece of paper, there were 3 little outlines of chicks, okay? And one chick was facing this way, chick number A, and chick number B was facing this way, and chick number C was facing this way. Now, those of you who have a right brain facility can picture that. The rest of you, what do you mean? Okay? So it was, and by the way, much of Sesame Street is based on this SRA kind of what's different here. Which one is not like the other? So Mark handed this to me, and he had checked off the, let's see, the second chick, was it? Yeah, I think it was the second chick in the process. So we've got chick here, and this one going this way. No, I'm sorry, he had checked off the first one. A. Now you all know what the right answer is, don't you? Chick A facing this way, chick B facing this way, chick C facing this way. Which one is not like the others? Which one does not belong? C. But he had checked off A, and the teacher had marked a big red X through it. That's wrong. So I said to Mark, well, why did you choose chick A? He said, it's obvious. It's the only chick that doesn't have a chick directly facing it. I said, not bad. I said, you tell the teacher that? He said, she didn't ask. I said, well, why did she think the right answer was C? He said, that's obvious. It's the one that breaks the sequence, but that's no fun. So then I said, well, you selected A and they told you it was wrong, but you had a good argument, and they told you the right answer was C, and you knew why that was the right answer. Now I want you to play one more game. He said, what's that? I said, choose B and tell me why that could be the right answer. He looked at it and said, oh, that's simple. It's the only chick that is flanked by a chick on either side. He's a bright kid. But he was also punished for creativity in the school. And it was a good school, and it was a good teacher. And that's what happens in our schools because we are a left brain dominant culture. Now, there are exceptions, and Karen may have been thinking of those when she said right brain. Musicians, actors, maybe athletes. I'm a little less clear on where athletes' dominance is. But that's because of our technology. And if you look at the history of humankind, you'll find that those people got very little of the rewards of society until TV and mass distribution came along. Starving artists, musicians all over the place. Right brain dominant people. We really don't put an enormous amount of value and we don't put a lot of resource into that in our society. So there are all kinds of interesting implications here for education, for selection of teachers. For example, there have been many, many reports criticizing education in this country. And they all kind of say the same thing. We need better teachers, which means we need to pay them more. What do they think better teachers are? These reports are always written by left brain dominant people, by the way. What do they think a better teacher looks like? What would they go, if they had a larger pool of people because they offered more money, which people would they select from that larger pool to teach in the schools as the better teachers? How would they know they were going to be better teachers? What criteria would they use? Do you have any idea at all?
Left brain.
Left brain. What would they look at?
Test scores.
Test scores? Right. Standardized test scores, GPAs, grade point averages. They would get more left brain dominant people in the schools. Well, I'll give my own editorial opinion here. What we need more of in the schools is right brain dominant teachers with excitement and imagination and passion for what they do, not more PhDs for crying out loud. So it's an interesting conceptualization of how the brain works. But now let me get to the thing that I think is important for our purposes of self-design here today. In a left brain dominant culture, which we surely are, have you noticed that left-handed people have always been second-class citizens? This has a very long history, by the way. The Latin word for left, anybody know it? Sinister. Very good. The French word for left, gauche, clumsy, awkward. And by the way, if in the early days of this country you were accused of witchcraft and you were left-handed, you were in deep trouble, because some people believed that left-handedness was a sign from God that these people were the devil's disciples. I mean, we're talking to me. There are people in this country alive now who, when they were growing up and showed this natural genetic tendency to left-handedness, had their left hand tied behind them at mealtime so that they would be right-handed people. What we didn't notice, of course, was they often developed stutters as a consequence of having that natural tendency squelched. But in a left-brain dominant culture, we've been taught left-brain dominant ways of attempting to design ourselves or change ourselves. All of us in our lives have seen something or had something brought to our attention that said, you really ought to change that. I lose my temper too quickly. I don't feel confident in front of a group of people. We've all had things we wanted to change and other things that people have said we ought to change in us. Now think of the left brain dominant model and then begin to look at how you were told you were supposed to change yourself. What were you supposed to use? What were you supposed to dig in there, deep inside of yourself, to change this bad habit, this bad pattern, this bad series of thoughts, or inappropriate, dysfunctional emotional response, or these behaviors that were always getting you into trouble? How were you supposed to go into yourself and change yourself? What were you going to use? Willpower. Self-control, self-discipline. How well has it worked for you so far? And if you didn't, they called you names. You were weak-willed, and you started saying things about yourself. What's the matter with me? I want to desperately change this. People with phobias, they know it's irrational. I have a fear of flying. I have a fear of heights. I have a fear of closed places. I want to change that. I know it's irrational. And they sit there and fill themselves with all kinds of conviction, but they don't change, do they? Realization, another film clip here from what in many ways is a depressing sort of film, although it has an up at the end. The Man with a Golden Arm, Frank Sinatra. And this is a fairly old film, by the way, and he's drug addicted. And he wants to change himself. He went through detox and he got cleaned up, and then he fell back again under the influences of his environment, and he now knows it's destroying his life. But even Frank Sinatra, as a drug addict in this film, has a realization. And he was saying, look, I can't do this myself. Willpower isn't enough. Now, of course, drug addiction is an extreme case. And it turns out that for most of what you're concerned about, you can do it yourself, but you need the help of the right method, the right tool, the right technique. Okay? And again, that's where we're going today. To a way of going inside your head and altering anything you want to alter. And one of the beauties of this approach to self-design is nobody else can do it to you. You have to step back and say, hey, I want to do this in my own head. I want to design me in the following ways. I want to produce the following changes in the way in which I do things out there in the world. But I was raised self-discipline, self-control, willpower, that's the way to do it, and it just didn't seem to work. And then I say, oh, well, there must be something wrong with my will. I've got to build my willpower. I've got to build my self-control, build my self-discipline. It still didn't seem to work very well. Why is that? Well, what we now know about the brain is that you and I are not only an accumulation of a whole bunch of things that were put into our head without our permission. Those things are, for the most part, absolutely on automatic. Again, how many times in your life have you gotten really angry in some interpersonal situation? You calm down, and then you start to use your left brain, your self-talk, as it's referred to, and said, that was not in my best interest, that was stupid. The next time I'm in that situation with that person, I am not going to get angry. And you filled yourself with conviction and resolve, didn't you? What happened the next time you got in that situation with that person? Okay, but listen to the way I'm going to describe it now. The anger tape played. Why? It's the only neurological destination in your brain that that stimulus knows to go to. The brain has to send it to the place it knows because there is no other place to send it. That's one of the things we now know about self-design. You have to have an alternative destination in your brain for the stimulus. The stimulus isn't going to go nowhere. The person's going to say whatever they've said 100 times before. You're going to hear it. Your senses are going to pick it up. It's going to whirl around in your central processing unit. It's going to end up somewhere. Where's it going to end up? The only place it knows to end up, the anger response or the insecurity response. Gee, I want to lose some weight. I want to get in shape. How many times have you done that? Or people say, boy, I'm an expert at stopping smoking. I've done it hundreds of times. But again, we try the cold turkey. We try the willpower. And most of the time, for most of us, it doesn't work. Why? Because it's incompatible with our understanding of how the brain is structured. What we've now discovered about the brain is one of the things that we do is totally dysfunctional and counterproductive. Again, take the example of anger. And what at best do we say to ourselves? I'm not going to get angry when that person does that again. And you rehearse that in the left side of your brain. That's a belief. That's a self-talk kind of process. What we now know about the brain is every time you say, I'm not going to get angry when that person does that, the right side of your brain is rehearsing anger as the response to that person. You are, at a subconscious level, actually rehearsing exactly what you don't want. Why? Because the right side of the brain cannot process not. Here's the imaginative, visualization, intuitive side of the brain. Here's the symbolic, linguistic, arithmetic side of the brain. Margay, I don't want you to think about a pink elephant. What picture immediately came into her head? What does it look like, this not pink elephant I'm supposed to? It doesn't look like anything. What's it look like, Henry, when you're not driving your car? What's the picture you have in your head? There is none. Why? Because there's an infinite set of things you could be doing when you're not driving your car. What we now know, and this is not the same thing as the power of positive thinking, that's a separate topic. What we now know is anything you want to change in your head in the way of belief or emotion or behavior, you have to have an alternative belief as a substitute, an alternative emotional response, and an alternative behavioral response. If you don't want to feel angry, then what do you want to feel? Do you want to feel calm? Do you want to feel confident? Do you want to feel joyful? How do you want to feel? And then, as we'll see in much more detail, you have to rehearse how you want to feel. You have to rehearse your emotional response. You must, by imaginative rehearsal, create an alternative neurological destination for that stimulus out in the world. And until you do that, no matter what your rationale is, no matter what your conviction is, until there is a solidly anchored alternative place in your brain for the stimulus to go, it will continue to go where it's always gone, and you get there frustrated. The person engages in the behavior, and you get angry again. In fact, if you were like me, you experienced anger squared. Don't you remember that one? You started to get angry, and then what did you do? You got even more angry at the fact that you were getting angry when you said you wouldn't get angry. What's the matter with me anyway? Nothing's the matter with you. You've been using the wrong tool, the wrong approach to the alteration of how your brain and the rest of you responds to the world. This business of doing the wrong thing. I'm not going to get angry. I'm not going to get nervous. I'm not going to get upset. I'm not going to think those thoughts, is called the Wallenda Effect in social psychology. Anybody remember the great Wallenda? Fell to his death, high wire walker, fell to his death, curious. Why? The weather was fine, there was no high wind, the equipment was in perfect condition, he seemed to be in great shape, and yet he fell to his death on what should have been an easy walk for him. A few months after his death, a reporter went to talk to a widow for a magazine article and said, Mrs. Wallenda, everyone's puzzled. What happened? She said, I don't know. The reporter said, was there anything different that you can remember in his behavior before this walk? She said, yeah, there was one curious thing. For about 3 months before he did this walk, all he could talk about, and this was absolutely brand new, he had never done this before, all he could talk about was not falling. What was the right side of his brain doing every time the left side of the brain was talking about not falling? He was rehearsing falling. There is some evidence, and again, this is speculation, I don't want to overstate the case at all, that clumsy people rehearse being clumsy. I'm not going to drop this. I'm not going to stumble. What's their brain doing? It's rehearsing dropping things and stumbling. You've had a similar experience yourself, I'm sure, when you've taken an automatic behavioral program and put it on conscious control, haven't you? You ever taken a cup of coffee or a cup of soup up the stairs saying to yourself, I got to be careful, I don't want to spill this. And your hand's going like this. If you didn't think about it and just walked up the steps, you'd be fine. If you allow that automatic behavioral program, but as soon as you begin to take conscious control of certain automatic programs, they become much more awkward. If you do that in sports, if you start to think consciously about your next move is very slow and very awkward. It's got to be automatic. Most of what you and I do most of the time is on automatic. So, we've learned a great deal about what does and what does not work. One more example. You go into a restaurant. You decided you're going to slim down. You're not going to have that dessert. You walk by the dessert cart, and there is your favorite dessert. In my case, chocolate mousse. We're talking heavy duty, huh? So here I am walking by this dessert cart saying, I'm not going to eat that chocolate mousse. If I'm a little reflective, I will notice at the same time that I am declaring I'm not going to have that for dessert, I am salivating. What's my right brain doing? It's rehearsing all the wonderful experiences it has had with chocolate mousse over the years. And what will I do? I will order a consommé with my entree and rationalize one more chocolate mousse by the end of the meal. One of the things we know, by the way, about the left brain and right brain in most human beings, when there really is a tension, when there is a struggle between what you believe and what you feel almost always wins. The right brain comes in there and grabs you and forces the left brain to rationalize. Well, what's one more? Hey, I worked out today. And all these wonderful left brain beliefs and reasons come into the service of that right brain lust after chocolate mousse. You don't want to put your brain into that kind of tension. Believe one thing, feel another thing, and now you don't know how to behave. There's another way out. But what I'd like you to think about for the next few minutes is something in yourself that you would like to override, and that's the term we're going to use when we talk about reprogramming or self-design. Again, I don't want to use reprogramming or erasing. You're going to override whatever that automatic program in your brain is now by a very, very specific method. As you're thinking about it, because these things are well hidden in us, again, most of what you and I are is not of our own design. Where did you get most of your emotional responses to stimuli out in the world? Do you have any idea? The things that, quote, make me angry. You ever use that phrase? That makes me angry? Or makes you insecure? Or makes you fear-filled? Or you can't stand? Do you have any idea how it is that you can't stand it and other people can? How it makes you angry but doesn't, well, I guess that's the way I am. No, that's not the way you came into the world. That's not your gene pool that's producing those responses. What is it? What you were taught. Do you have any idea how you were taught to have most of your emotional responses to various arbitrary stimuli in the world? How did you learn this stuff? Any ideas?
Watching other people.
Watching other people. Watching what about them?
How they did it.
How they did it. How they reacted to it. What we know about child development, as you and I were in our most formative years, birth, 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, we were trying to figure out what the world was all about. And how do we figure out what the world was all about? What to want and what not to want, what to be afraid of and what to feel confident with respect to. By absolute, accidental, arbitrary imitation. We are incredible emotional mimics when we're very small. You can't imagine how quickly you learned. You take a small child and it's sitting in a family room or a living room or a bedroom by itself watching a show. The snake comes on. Doesn't bother the child. Until the relevant adult on the TV shows fear. Until a relevant adult at a zoo says, "Oh, snakes." And then what does the child say? "Oh, that's how I'm supposed to feel." We are arbitrarily taught our fears and our joys, our angers and our sorrows. Our emotional repertoire is an accident. That's a big part of the accidental self. Well, do you want those things in you? The example I often use, if you were raised in a country that had poisonous snakes all over the place, or you were raised in the family of snake handlers, do you think you'd have a fear of snakes? No. Your parents wouldn't think of giving you a fear of snakes. Why? Because you'd be afraid all the time. So what do they give you as a device to keep you safe?
Another set of behavior.
Sets of behaviors based upon
Nothing.
knowledge and skill. Knowledge and skill. You don't want to be afraid of something that's dangerous and common in your environment. You'd be afraid all the time. What object in your environment has the highest probability of killing or maiming you? Car. You afraid of cars? Your teenage children, they're afraid of cars, aren't they? Afraid they won't get one. You wouldn't think of making somebody afraid of something that was really dangerous. You want to give them knowledge and skill. Fear is unnecessary, it's uncomfortable, it's unreliable, it can lead to panic or paralysis. And yet you and I are a bundle of enculturated fears. Not just fears of snakes and rats and bats and spiders. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of disapproval, fear of authority, fear of loss of job, fear of pain, fear of death and dying. And that has enormous implications for our patterns of behavior. And it has even greater implications for the quality of our lives. Fear is a great subject in literature. Don't you ever see the Dune trilogy as a movie or ever read it? Much better read than seen. It's a book about fear. Fear is referred to as the mind killer, the little death. Because the author of the Dune trilogy knew how paralytic fear is for all of us, and if you can overcome your fear. A great deal of Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion is about overcoming fear. The samurai, the samurai's chief focus, overcome fear of death, and watch how that changes the patterns of your behavior. It not only changes the patterns of your behavior, it changes the quality of your life. Are there people out there in the world who can tap into your fears, who can push your fear buttons and influence you? Are there people who can push your fear buttons and alter the quality of your life? I'll bet there are. That's an affront to my sense of autonomy and control and the fact that I want to be calm and joyful in life. You can be. This isn't off-the-wall stuff. This is the basis for a great deal of clinical psychology. It's the basis for the training of athletes and craftspeople. It's the basis for retraining people in special forces whose enculturated fears in the U.S. have to be overridden if they're going to be any good out in jungle warfare or reconnaissance. We now know how to do it inside the brain. It's absolutely amazing. You think of any other conceptual, emotional, behavioral programs? I don't want any, real personal stories here. I'm talking about the generic stuff that's out there in the culture that was put into your head and my head without our permission before we had any critical faculty. Anything else you'd maybe like to look at inside yourself, as I have inside myself, in addition to all your fears, by the way? That'd be a nice start. Karen the Fearless. Yes, Don?
Well, a lot of people that we work with are afraid of speaking.
Public speaking, as a colleague of mine says, the three greatest fears of American: public speaking, cancer, and heart disease, in that order. Why? They've been enculturated to be afraid of it. They've been taught to be afraid of it. They saw or themselves were embarrassed in some situation of a public kind where they got up or somebody else got up and stumbled and looked foolish. And they said, "Oh, I never want to do that."
And they were usually little kids when that happened.
That's right. And it's all so arbitrary. I had a great good fortune. I started public speaking when I was in 6th grade. And by coincidence, by accident, I got the accolades and the positive reinforcements rather than the embarrassment. If the first time I did it was embarrassing for me, I probably wouldn't be here today. Because I was in my formative years and one little pain, and I'm not going to do that again. Let's play a few more out there that I'm just, somewhat proselytizing about this because I see it, as I said earlier, this is the pathology of the world. Every culture puts these dysfunctional garbage programs into people's heads, not maliciously, not as some sort of a plot, but as some sort of historical accident. Guilt. My little granddaughter, Eleanor, 10 weeks old, what sort of guilt do you think she has? Not a bit. But what will happen as she grows up? A whole bunch of people, not me, I get my hands on her. Not going to have this stuff.
How about change?
Fear of change. That gets a little more interesting and subtle, doesn't it? Because people aren't genetically fearful of change, are they? It isn't hardwired into us. But why are people most fearful of many changes? Not all changes, by the way, because changes have been imposed upon them. And they've had negative experiences of the changes imposed upon them. By the way, I mean, if you won the lottery, hey, Laura, you just won $100 million in the lottery, you're going to say, hey, that might change my life. I'm not going to accept that. We're not against all changes. We're against changes imposed, the changes we don't have a sense of control over. Uncertainty. We want predictability. We want security. We want stability in our lives. We have been taught to be fearful of change. So we're taught to fear. Fear all kinds of things, failure and success and change and public speaking and pain and authority. We've been taught to feel guilty about things. We've been taught to blame. Infants don't blame anybody. But very early on, they're taught, oh, blame him, blame her, blame them, make you feel better inside. What else are we taught? We're taught to stereotype. We're taught prejudice. We're taught intolerance. We're taught to hate. Reminded of that great song from South Pacific? You've got to be taught to hate. The people whose skin is a different shade, the people whose eyes are differently made, you've got to be taught to hate. You've got to be taught to hate before it's too late, before you're 4 or 6 or 8. You've got to be taught to hate the people your relatives hate. We're taught. Infants don't hate anybody or anything. They're not intolerant. They're not into guilt. They're not into blame. They're not into fear. And then all this stuff comes pouring into their heads. This malleable brain of theirs gets imprinted with these programs. Well, I'll give you one more set that you might want to reflect on. There's a lot more, but this ought to be enough for the next couple of weeks anyway. One of the ones that's really getting a lot of publicity in our culture these days, stress, pressure, anxiety. Everybody's going to stress management seminars. What do those seminars assume? What does the title, stress management, assume?
You can manage stress.
That you can manage stress, then indeed that's the only thing to do with it, because it is inevitable. Why we live in stressful times. We have stressful jobs. We live in stressful environments. It is an anxiety-producing world, we are told. Now, I know this is going to go down hard. You learn stress. There are a few exceptions, physiological stress and so on, but you learn to feel psychological stress. You are taught to feel stress and anxiety and pressure in a variety of situations. There are no stressful environments. There are no stressful jobs. There are no stressful situations. What are there out in the world? A series of stimuli that most people have been taught to translate in their heads into a stress response. We each have these little translation boxes in our heads, but we don't acknowledge the presence of the translation box. You feel stress. How have you been taught to explain it? To what do you attribute the stress, the anxiety, the pressure that you feel? To the arbitrary learned translation box in your head? Is it just, oh boy, I had my old translation box is kicking up the stress again? Is that what you say?
Outside.
The person, the situation, the topic. Haven't you ever been in a situation where everyone was deeply anxious except one really annoying person?
Right.
And why is that person so annoying? Because they are proof positive that that situation does not necessarily trigger stress or anxiety. And that bothers us because it's a counter instance of what we want to believe. That creates this. The number of times I am standing shoulder to shoulder with a colleague at the university, and the colleague, it happens almost every day to me, partly because I'm a division chair, and people are always coming to me. I heard yesterday, did you see what he did? I say, yeah. Aren't you upset? I say, no. Well, then you didn't see what he did. It's as though those actions, those data fragments of that other human being must inexorably create anxiety or fear or tension or pressure in someone's head. And I'm serious. I mean, I am a product of my own concepts here. And people are really mystified by this. Don't you ever get upset? I said, when I want to. But you're not going to decide if I get upset. And I'm not going to allow a series of arbitrary, accidental connections that were made in my life before I had any critical faculty to decide my emotional responses nor the quality of my life. Well, that's mystifying to them. You don't have to. You can design yourself as an adult. You can take anything that you want. And maybe you don't like the ones I've given you. I'm not big on anger. Some people are big on anger, and there's a lot of literature out there that justifies anger. Just anger, biblical anger, Christ's anger in the temple. Everybody's anger is just anger. Have you noticed that? I mean, there's no anger except just anger. Or that most curious of all phrases that I'm sure you have heard, if not yourself uttered, I have a right to be angry. Now, what is it? Unalienable? And you must exercise it at every possible opportunity? Is that what kind of a right it is? Do you understand how we've been taught? Do you understand that every time you say, he makes me angry, she upsets me, she drives me up a wall, I can't stand her, when people do things like that, my blood boils? Do you understand that every time you engage in that kind of self-talk, or that talk to someone else, what you're doing is making it true? You are rehearsing anger and upsetness. Your brain is saying, every time Don does that, I get angry. That means in the future, every time Don does that, I will get angry. It is an act of emotional suicide. We have been taught to turn control of our emotions over to situations and stimuli and people. Now, when phrased that way, it seems absurd. It seems foolish, doesn't it? Why would we do something like that? To escape responsibility for thoughts and feelings and behaviors we don't want to take responsibility for. Listen to the phrase, she makes me angry. Good heavens, I have no choice. You want to design yourself? You stop doing that. You stop reinforcing all of those scripts that other people gave you. You stop rehearsing negative emotional and conceptual. Oh, I really hate it when people do things like that. Let's rehearse the old hate. People say, well, if you don't hate, you won't be motivated. I'm motivated. I can right wrongs. I can play Don Quixote de la Mancha. But what I know about hate, what I know about anger, what I know about fear and insecurity is it makes me less effective. It destroys the quality of my life. And if I don't design myself, then everybody else out there decides how I feel.